Good afternoon, good evening, and today we have a doozy.
What about tomorrow?
Well, actually, considering the size of it, maybe two or three doozies.
What's a doozy?
A doozy is like, a doozy. It's like a dizzy, but with O's. Or U's, depending on how you spell it.
I think it's O's.
O's makes more sense. So anyway, today, at this time, we'll be looking at Solomon's prayer of dedication for dedicating something.
Dedicating babies?
Sure.
Oh, cool. I like babies. They're so cute.
What is he dedicating here? It is the temple, right?
Yeah, it's a temple.
So this is Solomon's dedication of the temple. And before we even start reading this, a couple of things. First of all, this prayer is 1,050 words long.
Which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it is.
It's a whole thing. It's a lot.
It's a pretty long prayer.
Yeah.
It really is. It's the first prayer that we've had that's more than one page
Yes.
of text.
The other thing that I wanted to point out is, if memory serves,
Probably doesn't.
this is, if not the first, then one of our first public prayers in the Bible.
Oh yeah, public prayers.
And
Any others?
if it's not our first, then the overwhelming majority of the past prayers we've been doing are private prayers between either an individual, one or two individuals, and God.
Well, it's certainly the most public. I mean,
Yes.
he has
An basically
entire nation. I mean, I'm sure not the entire nation was there, but I'm sure
the majority of the nation of Israel, at the very least, is in front of him at the temple while he's giving this prayer.
Yeah, like if you ever see those videos, I know I saw. We were looking at Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington D.C., and you look at there's this crowd of people all down through the whole. So you see pictures or stadiums full of people. This is
the thing that I love most about his "I Have a Dream" speech is that it was improv. Because he was giving a regular speech, and then one of his friends in the front of the crowd calls out, "Martin, tell him about the dream." And then he just goes into this thing that was totally unplanned, that he had told his friend a couple days before.
Unless he planted the guy to say that so that it could seem like.
I guess that's possible, but that's a lot of work and effort to put into it.
Yeah.
I don't.
So, do you think Solomon's prayer here was improv, or do you think he planned this out?
I mean, I'm sure he planned that he was going to do a prayer for the temple, but I mean,
How well did he outline it?
He walked up there with a manuscript in Hebrew.
Well, I mean, honestly, I know some people who, because they get nervous in front of a crowd, they write out what they're going to say in their prayer, and that's fine. That's a good idea, so you don't get stumbling over your words and wondering what you're going to say next.
Yeah.
I know other people who just have a list. Maybe they have people they need to pray for, and maybe some things that they need to pray for, and they have that on a list. And I know other people that just it's all on a list up here in their head. I guess they don't really write anything down. So I don't know. I wonder. I mean, we don't know about Solomon, which one of those three he was, but he could very well have had something written down. This was certainly a very formal occasion, as, again, he's dedicating the temple that his father David wanted to build and didn't get to.
Yep.
But the temple that he got to build, and it was years building this temple. So he had plenty of time to think about what he was going to say.
Yeah.
This wasn't just like a spur of the moment. Hey, Solomon, can you get up and give us a prayer?
Yeah.
This was like something that was coming for a long time. And he, as wordy as he is in a prayer, he could have been a preacher.
Yeah.
He could definitely have preached, because he says lots of words.
But anyway, since this is a public prayer,
1 Kings chapter 8.
Yes, it's in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 23 through 53.
That's a lot of verses.
While we're reading through this, pay attention to it, kind of mentally compare it to some of the other prayer studies we've done, and see if you can kind of see how it's different from other prayers that we've been looking through. Sound like a good plan?
Yeah.
All right.
And I think one of the first things we'll notice, just compare it back to the prayer that we had, that David had about God's promises to him about his lineage, because that's kind of where we start.
Yeah, it's very similar here. So let's start. O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept with your servant David, my father, what you declared to him. You spoke with your mouth, and with your hand have fulfilled it this day. Now therefore, O Lord God of Israel, keep for your servant David, my father, what you have promised him, saying, You shall not lack a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel, if only your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me as you have walked before me.
There it is. There it is.
It's very important.
Now, it's interesting, this promise, he said, you've promised this, but notice this promise is what we call a conditional promise.
Mm-hmm.
There are people to this day, 3,000 years later, who still think that David's descendants need a king sitting on the throne, when God was very specific that if they listened to him, if they followed him, if they paid attention, then he would make sure that they stayed on the throne.
Yep.
And Solomon starts the pattern of not paying attention later on in his life.
And if you know your history, your Jewish history rather, they stopped listening, and every now and then you'd have a son of David who did a little bit better than the others. But for the most part, Israel on the whole, David's line, they stopped paying attention to what God wanted, and so God is eventually just like, okay, yeah, you're done.
Wonder if anybody ever reminded Solomon of this prayer later in life when he was going away from God. And do you remember that prayer you prayed back when we...
Another interesting thing here is when we think about God, we think a lot about his unconditional love and how God just, he loves us. It doesn't matter what we do. He has grace and love for us, and that's always going to be there. Well, yes, but sometimes I think we take that unconditional aspect and we spread it like all over God's character and just all the things that God is. He's like that unconditionally. It doesn't matter what we do. He's just going to be like that. And yet
we forget he's also a God of his word, and if he promises something good or bad, he'll do it. And he's a God of justice as well as mercy.
But what I'm trying to get at here is that while he does have unconditional aspects of his nature that are just going to happen, from this promise we can see that because he keeps his word, like Dad said, he can come up with rules, deals with us, basically, promises, where he only does them if we do something first.
Yeah.
Where he only is good to us or does something for us if we follow his commands and instructions. And that's something that I feel like a lot of people miss out on about God. They're just like, oh, God's going to be good. God's always going to do this. He's great. He's all these things.
We expect God to bless us when we don't bless him.
Exactly.
So to speak.
We expect God to do good things for us in our lives when we're not even listening to him anymore. Yeah. And if we're not listening to him, then why do we expect him to listen to us and do what we say and what we want when we're not paying attention to him and listening to what he says and what he wants us to do?
Yeah.
Moving on.
Verse 26.
Yes. Now therefore, O God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant David my father. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?
That's for sure.
Yet
God can't be limited.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea, O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day towards this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer and that your servant offers toward this place. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about this section, close to the beginning there, where he's like, will God dwell on the earth and in this house that I've built? You think about the house that Solomon had built here. it was so great and awe-inspiring that when the Jews come back from Babylonian captivity and they rebuild the temple, and it's amazing and wonderful, and everyone's cheering and shouting and praising how good their work is and how beautiful it is, the old men that saw Solomon's temple are crying, absolutely crying, because they know how beautiful the temple used to be, how great Solomon's house that he built for God was.
And I think some of that is more than just the structure, the physical structure itself. There's some debate about it, but obviously after Solomon finishes this prayer and everything, God's glory comes down on the temple. Kind of like the cloud that led the Israelites out of Egypt. So
And
God's
like-
glory comes down on
And that's what
temple.
Solomon asks here.
Right,
He's like,
that's right.
God, come fill this house.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah, we know you can't dwell here. You know it can't hold you because the whole heavens can't contain you. But will you please at least? This is where you said you wanted to put your name, and there's no indication that when they build that second temple after Babylonian captivity, that God ever comes in His glory like that again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of them talking about the former glory that's missing from the second temple. It's not just that the building isn't as good, although this building is amazing. I did some calculations one time on the value of this temple, and it was astronomical. Unbelievable how expensive it would have been in today's value. Just, I mean, not even counting the labor and everything that was involved.
Like just so
the
much gold
just the
and
materials
bronze and
that he put into it.
yeah.
Yeah, and it was millions of dollars just for the materials, and then you think about the labor and everything. But yeah, definitely, this temple, one of the most amazing things that human beings have ever built.
Mm-hmm. And part of its amazingness was also, like you said, because God did actually put His glory into it.
Yeah, he comes down, and people could look and see, wow, there's the glory of God right above the temple.
Mm-hmm.
That's an amazing thought.
All right, so in this next section, we're going to be getting into some more of the promises. And these are promises that Solomon is kind of putting before God and asking God to accept them and keep them. And we're going to look a little bit more at the way promises work with that, I think.
Yeah.
And listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray towards this place. And listen in heaven, your dwelling place. And when you hear, forgive. If a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath and comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness.
Yeah, he's asking God to, and not even necessarily when they come to the temple, but if they just, if they're out somewhere and they, turn toward the temple and pray toward it. And we see this with one of the most prayerful men in the Bible, one of your favorite characters, Daniel would go 3 times a day, and he would go and he would look out the window facing Jerusalem, even though the temple wasn't even there anymore, but just where that temple used to be, and he would pray to the Lord. And of course, God did hear him. I don't know that it's just because he was facing the right direction. No. That's not the idea. And certainly, facing a specific direction, it's not necessarily even the physical orientation of somebody looking toward the temple. But what Solomon's really asking here is, when people think about your house that we've built for you, that your place of worship, the place where we come to worship you, and when they think about that and then they pray to you, listen to them. Mm-hmm. Listen to those people wherever they might be.
Right. 33.
Mm-hmm.
When your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they turn again to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them again to the land that you gave to their fathers. So that's another promise that
He's like, yeah,
Solomon's
please do
asking.
this. And so it's interesting. He's kind of like he's making this supplication. He's asking God something, but he's also asking God to keep this promise, not just to him, but for all Israel, for generations.
And it's interesting thinking about this in the context of a public prayer, that he's praying to God, but he's also like giving out ideas to the people where it's like, I'm saying these things to God, but at the same time, if you have a problem, if something's wrong with you, come to the temple and pray to God. And he's doing it in a subtle way where it's directed at God, but all the people in the audience listening will also get, oh, I need to be doing this.
Yeah, he's teaching the people secondhand, without just saying, "Hey, you guys, when you do bad, you need to pray to God."
Which is very interesting.
Yeah,
and we see that these things happen fairly often where a king or someone who is slighted is recorded going into the temple and at one point like hanging onto the horns of the altar and praying. And so it's interesting that what Solomon's praying for here is carried out, that the people actually do this.
We're all the way up to verse 35. In case you're keeping track, that means we've still got 20 verses to go.
Yeah, we should probably speed up a bit. When heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you, if they pray towards this place and acknowledge your name and turn from their sin when you afflict them, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel, when you teach them the good way in which they should walk, and grant rain upon your land, which you have given to your people as an inheritance.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting here that on the first one, on the first promise he asks God to keep, it's Israelites interacting with other Israelites. On the second one, it's Israelites interacting with their enemies, people outside of Israel. And on this third one, he's just talking about natural disasters.
Yeah, well, except that these aren't really natural. These are because they've sinned against God, and God is punishing them for it. And that's where this fourth one is much the same way.
Spoilers, we haven't read that far yet. The other thing that's interesting there is that at this point, like when
So you should have written down some notes.
I had this set up and I was like, I'm gonna phrase it like this, and then the perfect way that I was gonna phrase it just decided to go away. But anyway, at this point in verse 35, where he's like, when this is like this, like they did something bad and so you punished them, like it's understood that if something bad is happening, it's fairly likely at least that, you know, they did a bad thing. So, and that's just interesting that I feel like sometimes we feel like bad things just happen. And in some cases that's true.
Well, certainly we should examine whether we've caused bad things to happen by our behavior. But of course, the book of Job also does teach us that, you know, it's not always because we've done something bad. But here he's looking at, if this is the reason, when this is happening because of our disobedience, then we need to get our disobedience straightened out and get back to doing what's right.
Yep.
Right. Verse 37. If there is famine in the land, if there is pestilence or blight or mildew or locust or caterpillar, if their enemy besieges them in the land at their gates, whatever plague your people Israel, each knowing...
You skipped a line.
Well, sorry. Whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever plea is made by any man or by all his...
You skipped a line again.
I am so bad at this.
Or by all your people Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart and stretching out his hands toward this house.
I cannot read.
Then hear
I cannot look at words.
In heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each whose heart you know according to all his ways. For you only, Know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers.
That's a lot of bad things happening. I'll blame my bifocals. It was like mixing the lines up at different.
I've tried bifocals on before, I believe it. So the interesting thing here in comparison to the last one is that
these are some rough things here. These are things, even their enemy is coming into their land. So this isn't like they're going out to battle. This is they're being invaded.
the
even
interesting
here too.
and the interesting thing about this one compared to the last one, which I just double checked real quick, there's no mention of it being their fault. Like in the last one, it was like, oh, if there's a drought or a plague or something because someone sinned and they turn away from that and ask for forgiveness and pray for rain, forgive them and let the rain fall. In this one, it's just like, hey, if bad things are happening and they
And we
come
just
to you with burdens
come
on their
ask 'em.
hearts,
Yeah.
please help them. And so, and then it's also combining the second promise with the third promise, where it's like, if there are enemies being problematic and if there are just natural disasters being problematic, help us with all of those things.
Yes, and if it's not because of the bad that we've done, so here he does address the fact that it's not always their sin. So if it's their sin, they need to straighten that out. But if not, they still can come to God. He still wants them to be able to come to God and ask these things.
Now, this next one is very interesting. I think we're going to have a fun time with it. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and of your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays towards this house, hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of your earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of an interesting one because you have some situations like Naaman, for example, who's a foreigner who hears about God's great deeds, that he can be healed, and he comes and he's healed, and he says, I'm gonna worship this God now. He's healed me.
Or around Daniel's time, when the king sends out an edict to all the people that, hey, you should worship Daniel's God.
Yeah. And we see the same thing then in the New Testament with Cornelius. Cornelius is not a Jew, but he is praying to the God of the Jews, and God hears him. This
And
is
more than just hears him, he answers him as
the
well.
prayer, sends, has an angel appear to him, has him send for Peter, and Peter comes and teaches him how to be a Christian. But here we have, there's this idea, that develops later on in the Jewish nation, that if you're not a Jew, God can't love you or care about you. That you're worse than a dog.
Yeah,
And
even
that's not how it starts here. Solomon is saying, hey, if there's a foreigner who hears how great you are and wants to come worship you and praise to you, then please listen to them. And we see God doing that.
And even nowadays, looking back on the Old Testament, as the New Testament, there's a way that anybody anywhere can become a Christian, can be a part of God's family. But looking back on the Old Testament, we just see, the Jews just thought of them as dogs, and there was no way for people outside of Judaism to be saved at all. There's no way for them to, become a Jew, because that's just impossible. And we very often overlook sections like this where it's, hey, if a foreigner comes, listen to him, God.
We also overlook things like Rahab, which had come before this, or Ruth.
Comes
which
after
also,
this.
No, it's before this as well.
Time's weird.
Ruth is David. Well, it comes after this in the Bible, but in time it came before, because Ruth is like David's great grandmother.
Like I said, time's weird.
yeah.
The Bible's arranged in an odd
But
way.
also in Esther's time, which does come after this.
In both ways.
In both ways.
Yeah.
Are you sure about that?
I'm trying to arrange things properly.
Esther's time, which is what, of course, obviously that's during captivity times, and the people, many of the people, because God protects the Jews,
Mhm.
it says that many of them became Jews.
Mhm.
It's actually the first time in the Bible that the word Jew or Jews is used.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was actually during the book of Esther in that time.
There you go.
So there you go. Interesting. So people could convert to Judaism. They could become people who worshiped the God of Israel and became Jews.
All right. We still have a ways to go.
Yes, we do.
If your people go out to battle against their enemy by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to the Lord toward the city that you have chosen and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven their prayer and their plea and maintain their cause. So that one's interesting because he specifies by the way that you send them.
Yeah.
If they're going out to war in the way that you want them to, in the way that you have told them and specified.
So this isn't just we want to go fight. It's no, God said go fight, and so they're going the way He said. Yeah.
And so that's very important.
Yep.
If they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. Very nice to see that, this early on, they've already got that one figured out. A lot of people nowadays, I feel like, still struggle with that one. It's like, oh, I'm perfect. Sorry.
Or
no.
at least the things that are sins have been downgraded to
Mm-hmm.
not being sins anymore.
It's like, oh, that's part of who you are. That's your lifestyle. Don't worry about it.
We've changed which things are sins and which things aren't sins.
Yeah.
Redefine things.
And you are angry with them and give them to an enemy so that they are carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near.
Wonder if that ever happened.
Nah.
Solomon's a prophet of sorts right here.
Yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they have been carried captive, that's a mouthful.
They turn their heart. Notice I did. So it's not a matter of just like physical things, and their heart here not being the physical heart, but spiritually turn to God.
And repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly. If they repent with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause. And forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them. For they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Let your eyes be open to the plea of your servant and to the plea of your people Israel, giving ear to them whenever they call to you. For you separated them from among all the peoples of the earth to be your heritage, as you declared through Moses your servant, when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord God.
This last section, he's talking about them being carried off into captivity and everything. And I think about the times of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah was warning the people that they're going to be carried off into captivity.
Yeah.
And maybe it was because of this. Maybe it was because of what had happened with Solomon and this, that they had so much faith in the temple that they're like, oh, but the temple, God would never destroy his temple because that's the place where he put his name and so on. And so they had this trust and this sense of security and safety because they really believed the temple. And Jeremiah says to him, said, don't say the temple, because the temple's not going to save you.
Yep.
And so those people that were carried off into captivity, when they turned their heart back to the Lord, there was no temple anymore for them to turn to, because it had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. But
that said, the things that Solomon's praying for here carry the faithful ones of Israel through some very difficult times.
Yeah.
People like Nehemiah and Ezra and Daniel and Zerubbabel, who are staying true to God. And hang on, I want to get their proper names. Azariah, Mishael. What's the third one? Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. We always just call Daniel Daniel. We never use his Babylonian name.
Yeah. For those of you that don't know,
Often, anyway.
for those of you that don't know those three names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There you go. I heard a sermon one time where the guy was like, "Don't call them that. Those were their the pagan names that the Babylonians called them by. They would have abhorred those names because they were talking about false gods."
Wait,
and I'm
Didn't Daniel call them that
Yeah.
in his book?
Yeah. It seems funny to me, but
But it is interesting that Daniel doesn't call himself by the name they gave him,
yeah.
which is Belshazzar.
And for that matter, a lot of the some of the kings and stuff don't call him Belshazzar either. They say, of Daniel's God, not
Yeah.
Belshazzar's God.
Yeah, he may have made that much of an impact on him.
It's kind of odd.
But yeah,
Anyway, yeah. And then at the end here, after he does the thing about, being carried captive and repenting and all that, then he does a very broad blanket statement in verse 52. Let your eyes be open to the plea of your servant, where he's setting all of these promises before God and saying, please, keep all of these. He's reinforcing that again. And then he's saying, and to the plea of your people Israel, giving ear to them whenever they call to you.
Yeah.
So he's done all of these specific stuff about all of these specific instances. And then he's saying, hey, whenever they call to you, please listen to them.
yeah, and remember that they're your people. You're the one that brought them out of Egypt. You're the one that made them your heritage, your people. And so don't forget about them.
Yep. And in verse 52, I think that's a pretty important lesson we can learn about prayer as well. Is a lot of times I feel like I, and maybe other people in prayer as well, do broad blanket statements about things and be like, oh God, help me, just help me tomorrow. Like, with what? In what areas? Like, how do you need help? You can be specific.
Sometimes we don't even know.
Yeah, sometimes we don't. We can be specific, like Solomon does with the entire first section of this prayer, and then he follows it up with a broad general statement. So you can,
Whatever.
yeah,
Just,
you don't have to be one or the other. You can have both.
yeah.
And it's nice.
Well, a lot of times there are specific things that we have concerns about, but also because we as human beings don't know what the morrow brings.
Yep.
And so we sometimes do just have to say, hey, help me to make it through whatever comes my way tomorrow.
All right, so I don't know if we told you at the beginning, but we're doing a marathon, so we're going to go straight into the next couple of prayers.
Except that we're not, because it's already been over 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's great.
But since this
isn't
is
it?
our Wednesday night, hey, think of it this way. Normally church on Wednesday night's an hour. This is only 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's
33. So,
There you go.
that's a short
And
Wednesday night.
in all honesty, considering how long that prayer was,
Well, half the time was just reading it,
yes.
and a little time, and half time talking about it. So,
Mm-hmm.
But beautiful, beautiful prayer, and him dedicating the first temple.
There you go.
Before that, God had been in the tabernacle, and now here he is, the temple. They built this beautiful place for him that, probably to him seemed like a little mud hut.
You're forgetting Mama Vision. Did you see
Vision.
that? Did you see that commercial? It wasn't a commercial. It was a skit.
Little skit video. I remember something about Dad Vision and Mom Vision. How differently they see things.
But it's basically like Mom Vision is like the kid scribbles a little drawing, and then you got
she
mom
thinks
goggles
it's-
on, and it's like, oh, that's
that's the
Van
most
Gogh. It's a
beautiful.
masterpiece.
Some kids do draw better than Van Gogh. Now that you mention it, but yeah,
I don't know. I like some of Van Gogh's stuff.
that doesn't mean that it's drawn well. You can like things that aren't necessary. I don't know.
Discussion for a different time.
There's
For
drawing
now,
skill, and then there's.
It's been almost 35 minutes,
Almost.
so we'll let you
Are we-
go.
wait, we're not
If
going to
you're
go to.
still here, thank you for sticking with us. Please enjoy other videos and things.
And most of them are a lot shorter than this.
For the most part, yeah. and do the YouTube stuff that the YouTube wants you to do with the buttons and
I don't know
the
if you
other
should
buttons.
do all the things YouTube wants
Well,
you to do.
no, because
definitely.
YouTube's the thing with people.
And yeah, some of
Don't
those
do
people,
all the things that people want you to do, because
yeah,
that's bad.
That's bad too. But Solomon asked God to do all the things people wanted him to do.
Only if they were right with God. That's an
Well, he
important
said
thing.
whenever they pray.
But all through the prayers, like whenever they turn to you with all their heart, and if they're truly turned to God with all their heart, then they're not going to be doing anything. Bye.
Bye.